Hi, in this lecture, we're going to look at what makes us the same or not the same self over time as we change. What makes your past self and your present self and your future self all be one self? We're going to look at this through the lens of the show and also a little bit through the lens of the history of philosophy. This is really a classic philosophical question which gets answered several different ways in the literature and several different ways in the show. It matters a lot to the existential and ethical dilemmas that the characters face, especially Bojack, because Bojack really wants to know all season long whether he is really the same person who let Sarah Lynn die and did other kinds of harm in his life. Remember when he gives the interview towards the end of 6B, he says, I look back and I think, who was that guy? He really sometimes feels like he has turned into a different person, and he very much wants to have turned into a different person, but he's not sure if he has. He wants to know if he's the same person he was when he was a drunk, if he's the same person he was before he went through rehab. And this matters to his accountability. Is he the one to blame for Sarah Lynn's death? Is it somehow existentially unfair that he is now being held to account for this thing that happened several years ago? Or is it the case that even though he's very different now, it's the same him who's different, and hence it's the same him who is accountable? There have been several accounts of identity over time that have had currency in the literature over the course of the centuries, and several of them are played out in the show, as I mentioned. We're going to very quickly, so this lecture is going to go over a lot of material really fast, but we're very quickly going to look at basically 5 different ways of thinking about the continuity of the self or identity over time. We're going to look at, I'll just name them and then we'll talk about them. We're going to look at physical criteria, mental criteria, and under mental criteria, we're going to look at 3 kinds: memory criteria, similarity, and self-conception criteria. And then we're going to look at narrative accounts of identity and what I'm going to call rhythmic account of identity. So that's physical, memory, similarity, self-conception, narrative, and rhythmic. Drawing on the Maria Scheckman article that I had you read for a moment, she distinguishes between physical identity over time and mental identity over time, and then several different shades of mental identity over time. So the physical identity theory just says that you're the same person if you have the same body, right? It's a very straightforward, in one way, very straightforward criterion. If you're the same material object now that you were before, then no matter how much your mental life has changed or other features of your life have changed, you're the same entity and hence have the same identity. Even the physical criterion is not really as straightforward as it seems. For one thing, our cells regenerate, right? So we're not, in fact, materially identical to who we were several years ago. Most of our cells have switched since then. So we're going to need to say something fancier about physical organization or something like that. It's actually a very difficult problem in philosophy to figure out what makes a physical object the same physical object over time, even as its parts change. For another thing, we get transplants of organs and limbs, and we get prosthetic organs and limbs. So if a big chunk of our physical body changes, does that mean that we have changed into a different entity, or doesn't it? How much of us can change physically while still retaining physical identity? So even physical identity isn't as straightforward as it seems to be. But also the physical identity theory really doesn't match our intuitions. We tend to identify more with our mental life and with the events that happen to us and the actions that we do than we do with our physical body, even if our physical body is integrally important to who we are and our sense of self. So for example, if you imagine a thought experiment where you wake up tomorrow, all right, I don't even want to beg the question, so let me put it differently. If we imagine a thought experiment where all of a sudden tomorrow morning your consciousness shows up in a whole different body, and you wake up and you look down and your body doesn't look anything like you expected it to because your consciousness is used to being in a different body. Naturally, what you would say is, oh my God, my body has changed, not, oh my God, my mind has changed, right? Your sense of I, your sense of self, is planted in your mind and not in your body. Again, even if your body is in various ways deeply essential to who and what you are. And we talked about that a little bit in earlier seasons. So the physical identity criterion on its own doesn't seem to work. What about mental identity? The mental identity criterion is the idea that if you have the same mind or mental life over time, then you are the same entity. But what does that mean exactly? Because if you think about it, the contents of your mind are constantly shifting. You're thinking different things, you're experiencing and perceiving different things, you're feeling different emotions, you're learning different things. It seems like the contents of your mind are very fluid and fluctuating over time. So what would it mean to say that you are mentally, or in terms of consciousness, the same being now that you were before, or that you will be in the future, right? In what sense are the contents of your 5-year-old mind when you were a little kid relevantly the same as the contents of your mind now when you're in your 20s or whatever it is that you are? Well, there have been really three main versions of the mental identity criterion. The first and the most famous one comes from the philosopher John Locke, and it's what gets called the memory criterion. The idea here is if you can remember something, then it's you who did it, right? What ties us together over time is our memory. So it's because things you did when you were 5 are things that you can remember now that your 5-year-old self is a different time slice of the same self that you are now. And it's because your future self can remember what you're doing now that your future self will still be you as opposed to some other self. There are a lot of problems with this theory. For one thing, there are tons of things that we can't remember, but that presumably were still us. Right? I don't remember my first grade teacher's name, but presumably that was still me who was in first grade and had that teacher. For another thing, it turns out, once we've done psychological studies that were done well after Locke's time, that memory is actually incredibly reconstructed and unreliable. And at each moment when we feel like we are directly having memories, what we're actually having is pieced together memories that we are constructing in the moment. I think the image has frozen, so I'm going to stop here and start again.